New revelations of how some in the West Wing were thinking about the virus. At the same time, the president was playing it down publicly. White House economic advisor Peter Navarro warning about the threat of the coronavirus in two memos in January and again in February. Mr. Navarro predicting a, quote, full-blown COVID-19 pandemic that would take the life of as many as 1 to 2 million souls. On the CNBC Newsline now is the national political reporter from Axios, Jonathan Swan. He did break the story today. Jonathan, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
The president said repeatedly this evening in the news conference that he didn't see the memos. Do you have any reporting to suggest whether that's true or not?
I don't. What I do know for certain is that both memos were widely circulated, both within the White House and among other agencies. The January 29 memo went to many people. It was sent through the National Security Council. One of the recipients was Dr. Anthony Fauci, but lots of other people in the White House. But I don't know whether the president read either memo, but they're extraordinary documents just in terms of understanding the history of this time and how certain people sounded alarms early that weren't necessarily acted upon.
To be clear, the memos were directed to the president directly. Is it plausible to believe that he wouldn't have seen them?
It's certainly plausible to believe he wouldn't have read it. He's not a huge consumer of written material. I'm sure it landed on his desk. The second memo is addressed to the president, but I have no knowledge from my reporting. I don't want to speculate. I have no knowledge from my reporting whether the president actually read it or not.
How would your reporting suggest the memos were taken? Were they taken seriously as they circulated through the West Wing? And how would you say Mr. Navarro was viewed in the West Wing at that time when he wrote the memos?
The short answer is they weren't taken very seriously. And the context for that is a lot of people in the White House view Peter as someone who sounds the alarm about China every day of the week. So when you do that for 3 years, these memos were very, alarming. I mean, the first one says, this is in January, that the virus could kill more than 500,000 Americans, cost close to $6 trillion. For a lot of these people, their eyes glaze over when they receive a memo from Peter Navarro. So, no, the short answer is for a lot of people, there were definitely some, particularly in the National Security Council, Matthew Pottinger, who's a China hawk, much more aligned with Peter Navarro. But for a lot of people in there, it was just, oh, here goes Peter again, with another one of his anti-China, missives.
What's interesting is weeks after the first memo was written, the president himself continued to downplay the virus. He said on February the 19th, quote, "We're in very good shape." The second memo comes on February 23rd. And that's, to your point, when Mr. Navarro really turns up the alarm, as we read in the open, quote, increasing the probability of a full-blown pandemic. The president, though, and other members of his staff continue to downplay the virus. That's when Larry Kudlow comes on CNBC and makes the airtight comment. The president, a couple of days after that, says the virus is going to disappear like a miracle. And interesting, and I'd like your reaction to this. Tonight, the president was asked about his downplaying the virus and said the following: "I'm a cheerleader for this country. I don't want to create havoc and shock. I'm not going to go out and say this is going to happen or that is going to happen." What's your reaction to that?
Well, just from my reporting, you need to understand the context there, which is the president was running for re-election on one thing, the economy. And for Trump, the economy in large part equals the stock market. And so Trump and people like Kudlow were still, late January, certainly extending into February, late February, even into early March, very skittish about saying anything that would spook the markets or disrupt the markets. And so that's the context in which these memos landed. The president wanted to believe the best and was sort of willing himself into, power of positive thinking mentality, and was really focused on not saying anything that could stop his record-breaking run with the Dow.
Jonathan Swan, thank you very much for being here this evening. Appreciate that. That's Jonathan Swan of Axios. Let me turn back to you, Dr. Gottlieb. Your reaction to this remarkable story?
Well, look, clearly there were missteps. People are going to be writing books about this for a long time. But I would just put the memos in context, and it's not to, try to find an excuse for what transpired with these memos. I'm not privy to it, and I read the reporting. But at the time that these memos were written, the White House was implementing pretty extraordinary travel restrictions in terms of restricting people from China coming into the U.S. And I think that there was a view that you can implement these travel restrictions, prevent most of the viral infection into the U.S., most of the transmission into the U.S. by preventing people from entering the country who might be infected, and hopefully get into the summer, and the summer would be a backstop against transmission. So somehow you can avert an epidemic here. I'm not saying that that was good thinking. There were clearly missteps here, but there was a strategy that was being implemented. And I think there were a lot of people in the administration who really believed by putting in place those travel restrictions, you can delay the entry of the virus long enough that if you got into the depth of the summer, that would be a natural backstop against transmission. And there was some logic to that. I think it was always going to be the case that this became epidemic, and we were talking about that in January and February, but there were also people who believed that you could prevent the introduction of the virus in a meaningful way.
But you have maintained from the outset, certainly for the last many weeks that I've been speaking with you, that the biggest reaction to the virus itself and how it was going to be dealt with and mitigated was at the state level, that the states couldn't rely on the federal government to make key decisions. It was going to be left to the governors, correct?
Well, that's been the strategy of the administration, to defer to the governors on a lot of these decisions. And look, in hindsight being 2020, we needed a broad testing regime in place in January and February to do the early detection. If we were able to detect these cases earlier, we could have implemented case-based interventions and isolated people. But we didn't do that, and now we are where we are.
If Navarro's memos, though, were taken more seriously, as Jonathan Swan was discussing, would we be in a better place tonight?
Probably we would be. I think if that logic was infused across the White House, you might have had more urgency around trying to put in place broad screening, broad testing capabilities in late January, early February, and you might have detected some of these outbreaks before they became very large. Unfortunately, we really didn't detect the outbreaks in Seattle and New York and San Francisco until they were so large that we couldn't contain them. And then we started to seed ourselves. People from San Francisco and New York were traveling to other parts of the country and spreading infection.